Hello again, people. Thank you very much for tuning into the TKC Games channel. John speaking. We've got Geoff again this evening. I know you're probably getting bored of both our ugly mushies, but we are going to get someone else to come and join us pretty soon. And I'm loving Geoff's smile. You did that just to get me to laugh, you miserable so-and-so. You better watch out. I'll be asking about that toaster. Right? That's... And there's speculation about Geoff's toaster. Apparently, it fought him. Not quite sure who won. Anyway, so what we're going to talk about today, I think, is a wee bit about our forthcoming Las Malvinas title, the Falkland Islands in 1982, and a couple of weird things that we think we might be able to include, which might get you all interested in going somewhere else with the game systems that we do. So first things first, what is Las Malvinas? Well, it's the Between the Wars game title that examines the Argentine seizure of the Falkland Islands in 1982, and the British dispatch of a task force built around 2 small aircraft carriers and some amphibious assets and a few escorts and some Royal Navy nuclear submarines somewhere in the South Atlantic, who, in the Sun's inimitable headline, gotcha, managed to sink the General Belgrano. Now, bottom line is, it's going to be a bit of Navy, it's going to be a bit of air. There's going to be some ground pounding. And in the game, you're going to have to, depending what side you're on, take some value judgments as to the best way to operate. If you're British, your air power is about 40 aircraft split between 2 small, and I mean small, we're talking World War II escort carrier in one case, and the other one's a light carrier, like actually designed during World War II, HMS Hermes, two flat tops against about 100-odd land-based aircraft, many of them reasonably modern. Mirages, Daggers, the Dagger being an Israeli-built Mirage, of course. A4 Skyhawks and the odd Canberra. The Canberras didn't do very well because they didn't have missiles and the British did. And that kind of thing. There's obviously the actual invasion itself. I think from a game perspective, that's a battalion against a platoon. Being honest, if the Argentines don't win that, guys, stop gaming, just give up. You know, take up knitting or something, because you should win. But once the task force gets down south, you've got essentially 2 British brigades. One is elite with commandos and paras, and one's got some fat old guardsmen and some Gurkhas who never got to go and kill some Argentines in it. And you've got a task force built around combination of 1960s and 70s vintage Royal Navy escort vessels. As I say, 2 light carriers, both of them have about 20 aircraft aboard. And some fortunate, because we were actually going to scrap it, amphibious capability. Now, Geoff, what do you know about the Argentine forces in the Falklands?
Right. The troops on the ground are initially they're the classic archetype of not particularly well motivated, not particularly well trained conscripts. Most of the veteran Argentine military units are on the borders with various South American countries that aren't particularly happy with the regime in Buenos Aires. However, you do nonetheless have just enough well motivated, well trained and experienced officers that they do manage to whip some of those forces into shape. Yeah. And as British forces find at Goose Green and elsewhere, they can be defeated, but it does take a lot of time. And sometimes, as anyone that's read through accounts of Goose Green will know, it took quite a prayer, literally, for the British to be able to convince the Argentine units to surrender. So the idea that the Argentines on the ground were a walkover is actually quite a myth.
That's interesting. I mean, I know that the air defences around Stanley are actually quite capable. They've got half-decent missile systems. They've got very good radar-guided anti-aircraft cannon, and they do shoot down the odd aircraft. And despite the Black Buck Vulcan raids, which frankly appear to be something of a washout, I do recall at the time reading an article in the Glasgow Herald, and it was responded to by a Scottish ex-RAF World War II Mosquito fighter bomber pilot, and he said it was an absolute outrage that having flown X thousands of miles and dropped Y number of bombs that they actually missed. effectively in pretty much every raid with the Vulcans. Is it because if we knew in World War II, if we didn't take out a bridge or, you know, drop the walls of the Amiens prison, we were going back the next day till we did it. So we always got it right first time. Now, that kind of tells you that, you know, it was a bit jury-rigged what the British did. And of course, there's the interesting what ifs that I've read, and it depends on the book I've read. Some of them talk about Americans, the American government under Reagan, particularly Ronald, who seemed to get on really well with Mrs. Thatcher, effectively offering Maggie Thatcher the use of the American equivalent of her big handbag, which essentially was a carrier battle group built around the Carl Vinson and possibly, I think it was Carl C or Midway. And the idea being that Fleet Air Arm Roundels would be painted on the air group and the Americans go down and get us air supremacy. That was declined, but I believe we made a request for an Iwo Jima class LPH in case we lost one of our 2 decks, because they're roughly the same size and with some, what was it they said, retired military contractors, read US Navy staff seconded to the ship to operate the systems that we didn't know how to. It would have got us another deck in a hurry. Where we would have got an air group from, however, appears to be a whole different argument. And one might presume US Marine Corps AVAs instead of, you know, Sea Harriers, but who can say? But
it's looking at a suspiciously convenient purchase of F-14 Tomcats.
yeah, and the Carl Vinson and the Coral Sea, and 2 Ticonderoga class missile cruisers, 4 Spoons class destroyers, a couple of other missile cruisers, and a couple of probably Charles F. Adams class destroyers, which we might have borrowed from the Aussies because they did have 3 of them themselves. Yeah, I mean, I think if that lot had turned up, I suspect the Argentines might well have packed their bags and gone home. Because for all America's faults, and we could get into a very long discussion about what went right, what went wrong in Korea, what went right, what went wrong in Vietnam, what went right, what went wrong with, you know, US intervention in the Middle East and so on and so forth in the last 2 decades. The bottom line is the United States retains a capability, whether through their Navy or their Air Force, of gaining air supremacy, not even air superiority, complete air supremacy in a matter of hours over pretty much any part of the planet you care to mention. They have outstanding pilots, they've got excellent aircraft, and they've got the ability to project that power anywhere they so desire. And if the US had decided that they were going to get it back for us, I'm not sure it would just have been a couple of aircraft carriers. I'm pretty sure Strategic Air Command would have been using its non-strategic capability. You know, one Arc-like mission would have taken out Stanley, never mind the airbase. You know, it would have taken everything out. And the B-52s could have done it with a single in-flight refueling from some base in the middle of the States, you know. And you kind of start reading this, something we're going to have to look at in the game, about the huge amount of technical support that the British were given, whether it was an SAS team getting Stinger missiles and various other mod cons, including encrypted satellite comms equipment, shoved, you know, in their briefcases to take on a flight back to the UK on British Airways, which that must have been entertaining at security. What's that, boys? Oh, nothing. You don't need to worry about that. No, what's that? It's a Stinger missile. Don't worry. We can't shoot the plane from inside. It only works outside, you know. But that kind of thing that happened, satellite access, I believe the Americans did provide some electronic warfare assistance, although to be fair, the Chileans did a huge amount to help us that way. That all starts to come into factors we need to look at within the product. And of course, we also need to work out how to show standoff weapons within essentially a games rule set which are derived from World War II and TSWW. Now, the basic stuff, how a bunch of soldiers shoot at each other, that doesn't change. That's pretty much the same. And yeah, someone might have a Milan missile or a, you know, RPG-7 or whatever, but fundamentally it's still a rocket, right? That rocket's a wire-guided artillery piece. It's an artillery piece. It's not a big deal. But we need to look at the difference between Sidewinder and the Argentine French-built, very short-range dogfight missiles, which appear to have been completely outclassed by American technology at the time. We kind of need to look at how Exocet changes the naval equation, which again, I think might even be a full-blown discussion for you and I, Geoff, at some point, you know, if you fancy that. And if you guys want that, put it in the comments down below, right? Tell us what you want, because we're happy to do a bit of research and have a quick chat with you about it. But there's all of that kind of stuff we need to look at. And some of the ideas I've got is that standoff missile weapons are in the air, certainly for air-to-air combat, are probably a probability kill, in other words, you roll a die to get a kill on a zone of influence or a zone of control around the aircraft. So you fly into that, they can engage you at long range. And after that, there'd be a second die roll, perhaps, in air-to-air combat that looks at a dogfight capability. Fundamentally, the best dogfighting aircraft on the planet on the day that the Falkland Islands happened was the Harrier. It's got a higher power to rate ratio than anything anyone else has got. It can fly rings round stuff because, as the Marine Corps identified and BAE Systems then were able to teach other people that flew the Harrier, as did the Marines, you could vector the engine thrust and do weird stuff that physics doesn't permit an ordinary aircraft to do. Guys, just so you know, my understanding is modern jets, 5th and 6th generation jets, very often have partially or fully vectored thrust in their on their engines. The idea being it can beat physics. That's all derived from Harrier. So we turned up with an aircraft that everyone thought was a bit of a joke, but actually in its own field, doing the right things in the right way, it was a world beater. Right, we lost them to anti-aircraft fire and bad weather and pilot error. We didn't lose them to air-to-air combat, as far as anyone is aware. We need to look at point defence systems in modern ships. Now, we've already done an extended video where we looked at the loss of the Moskva. And she had 1970s, 80s era Soviet Gatling gun point defences, which don't appear to have been of any use whatsoever. The question then is the Western versions, or are the Western versions any better? We don't know, because when the Americans had I think they had one of their little frigates hit in the Gulf, but she wasn't at battle stations. They got caught out. In fact, there's some case to be made that the missile was actually fired at a tanker and it tracked on the American frigate instead of the tanker, which I find a bit hard to believe given it was the Iranians that fired the missile. And later on, the Iraqis did much the same thing. But if the point defences aren't really viable, do we then just end up with fire these things, you kill stuff? Don't know. We need to look at that. We need to think about it. So we're going to be doing it. We also need to look at the scale. Now, Geoff, I did send out some mapping. Take a look at it. Yep. Andrew will hopefully be able to, when I send him it, tag that bit of map in. So if he does, that's 15 miles to the hex on land. That's kind of the same as everything else we've been doing. But I'm looking at doing the Falklands in a bit more detail, because I think the combat needs to be company rather than battalion or brigade sized.
Yeah.
Because the Argentine regiments, from what I can tell, are broken down essentially into battalions, and the battalions themselves are broken down into company-sized units and scattered about all over the place, which does beg another question. If the Argentines had dispersed their air power on the islands, either helicopter lift, and fought a more mobile battle, because they did have some troops that could do it, would they have done better? And there's a little what if.
From looking at it, I can certainly see a sort of melding of two doctrines, where the Argentines have some fixed defences, which they do man reasonably well, combined with a more mobile hunting group, as it were. I can absolutely see that working quite well.
Yeah, it seems to me that the British caught a lucky break. That the ground force commander in the Falklands essentially married Puerto Argentinas, Port Stanley, when it was really a place where maybe he should have had an affair. You know, he should possibly have moved about a bit more. The other thing is, you know, the Argentines, from what I understand, essentially pulled a lot of their vehicles out, and some of the stuff never even got there, because the British were able to get their vanguard force down quite quickly. and the Argentines bottled or decided not to risk certain types of ships in their navy, which was pretty small, and much of it was World War II stuff rebadged as modern. So you've got, you know, Alan M. Summers or Gearing class Fram updated destroyers for the most part. There are 2 British-built Type 42s there, which are half decent. You've got 1, possibly 2, I can't remember if the second US-built World War II cruiser was still operational. I think she had possibly been laid up to provide spares for Belgrano. And the Royal Navy just managed to prove that World War II torpedoes still work and can still sink a World War II cruiser, fired from a nuclear submarine operating somewhere in the South Atlantic. Their carrier was never really able to operate because, unlike Hermes, she had not been fully upgraded in terms of propulsion systems, and she'd catapult problems, so she couldn't actually catapult her aircraft to a speed which would enable them to operate unless there was some wind. There wasn't enough wind, from what I understand, for the strike aircraft to operate off the carrier. But after the loss of Belgrano, they seemed to just say, right, okay, let's go home. Let's just defend the coast. Now, maybe the Argentine Navy missed a trick there.
Well, I remember you saying that she did manage to give one of our subs a quite hard time at one point.
Yeah. There's a book that we probably need to get and read that actually talks about Argentine anti-submarine operations from the Vicente de Meo, using American tracker aircraft. And the nuclear submarine that did make contact with the carrier and had a firing solution had to break off to get permission to fire, in much the same way that Conqueror did right before sinking Belgrano. But because of the intense air activity, she could never reacquire the carrier. Now, there's also some evidence that I've seen in one of the books that we've been reading. I've been reading about this, that the Argentines went for home and the British thought they turned actually towards the task group. So I think it was Scepter or Superb was looking in the wrong place, effectively, which maybe was quite good news for the people in that carrier. Because my understanding is she was given weapons free, take it out by London, if you can reacquire, but she never did.
No.
You know, and we can also look at some what ifs. The other thing that Geoff and I have kind of thought about is the first naval battle of the Falklands. So it's Admiral Speye's World War I flotilla that turns up. It's scared off with 2 practice rounds from a British pre-dreadnought, the Canopus, and they're then chased down by 2 British battle cruisers and essentially obliterated. That would be a really interesting way to introduce naval warfare in World War I to you all, and it's a taster for what TFWW, which Geoff and I have already been talking about in a previous video quite frequently, will be about, which is obviously World War I, the whole of it. But because of mapping concerns, we're already mapping the Falklands. It makes sense to chuck that in the box. It's not that many counters. It's 7 or 8 counters, and we might even be able to do the Battle of the Cornwall Islands, but I'd have to look at mapping for that. That said, a bit of blue will do, because there isn't much on the map where that battle happened, because the island wasn't in sight. So we could possibly do something fairly easily for that. If you guys fancy it, let us know. Tell us. If you want interesting stuff from us as product or content, please feel free. Geoff, thank you very much again. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for watching us. Please like it down below. If you don't like it, tell us. Please follow us and have a wee look at the websites that we're involved in. You'll get some information about what we do. And, you know, we've got a nice wee fun card game if you're a movie buff at www.6degreesgame.com. Feel free to buy some. We'd be delighted to sell you, delighted to see you playing it. And as I say, get in touch, let us know what you want. Have a good one, guys. Take care. Bye-bye.